Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science Society. Tonight, we are drifting into one of humanity's most beautiful and enduring adventures: the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece. A journey that began not with answers, but with questions whispered under starlit Mediterranean skies. Questions about the nature of existence, the meaning of virtue, the structure of reality itself, and what it means to live a truly examined life. As you settle into comfort tonight, imagine standing on the rocky shores of Ionia, where waves lap gently against ancient stones, where the air carries salt and the scent of wild thyme. This is where something extraordinary began to unfold nearly 3,000 years ago. In this place, beneath these same constellations that wheel overhead tonight, human beings began to ask why. Not just how things worked, but why they existed at all. They looked at the world with fresh eyes and decided that the old stories, the myths of gods and heroes, were not quite enough. They wanted something more, something deeper, something that could be examined and questioned and understood. If you find peace in these quiet explorations, I gently invite you to like and subscribe. Your support helps other sleepy souls discover this calm corner of curiosity, one peaceful thought at a time. But for now, all you need to do is breathe slowly. Allow your body to sink deeper into rest, and let your mind wander through the marble halls and olive groves of ancient Greece. Let us begin where Western philosophy itself began, in the questioning minds of those who dared to think differently. Philosophy, as we understand it today, emerged from a world steeped in mythology. The ancient Greeks had rich traditions explaining the cosmos through stories of gods and titans, of divine battles and cosmic eggs, of Gaia and Uranos, of Zeus hurling thunderbolts from Mount Olympus. These narratives provided meaning and structure to a world that could seem chaotic and frightening. They explained why the sun rose, why storms raged, why crops failed or flourished. Every natural phenomenon had its deity, every mystery its mythological solution. But in the 6th century before the Common Era, something shifted. In the prosperous Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor, where trade brought diverse peoples together and exposed Greeks to Persian, Egyptian, and Babylonian ideas, a new kind of thinking began to emerge. These coastal cities were places of commerce and cultural exchange, where traditional beliefs were constantly challenged by contact with foreign ways of thinking. In this fertile intellectual environment, certain individuals began to ask a revolutionary question. What if we set aside the stories of the gods and tried to explain the world through observation, reason, and argument alone? This was not a rejection of beauty or meaning. It was, in many ways, a search for a deeper kind of beauty, a more fundamental meaning. These early thinkers wanted to strip away the accidents and particulars to find the essential, the underlying, the eternal principles that governed all things. They were seeking what the Greeks called the arche, the first principle, the fundamental substance or beginning from which everything else emerged. The earliest of these philosophers were not called philosophers at all. That word, philosophos, meaning lover of wisdom, had not yet been coined. They were called the sophos, the wise ones, and they were as much scientists and mathematicians as they were what we would now recognize as philosophers. They investigated everything from the stars to politics, from the nature of numbers to the structure of the soul. In their hands, wonder became a method, curiosity became a discipline, and the simple act of asking questions became the foundation of a tradition that would shape human thought for millennia to come. Let your mind drift now to the city of Miletus, one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world. Its harbor welcomed ships from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Its streets bustled with merchants and sailors, craftsmen and scholars. And somewhere in those streets, around the year 600 before the Common Era, walked a man named Thales. Thales of Miletus is traditionally regarded as the very first philosopher, the one who began the extraordinary conversation we are still engaged in today. He was a man of many talents. Ancient sources credit him with predicting a solar eclipse in the year 585 before the Common Era, though modern scholars debate whether he truly predicted it or simply provided a natural explanation for one he had observed. He was said to have learned geometry from the Egyptians and improved upon their methods, using mathematical reasoning to solve practical problems like determining the distance of ships at sea or calculating the height of pyramids. He was counted among the legendary 7 wise men of Greece, revered not for mystical knowledge but for practical wisdom and clever insight. But what marks Thales as the first philosopher is his answer to that fundamental question about the ark. When Thales looked at the world and asked what everything was made of, what the fundamental substance underlying all diversity might be, he gave an answer that seems simple, almost obvious to us now, but was revolutionary in its time. He said, water. Think for a moment how radical this was. Thales did not say that Oceanus, the divine personification of water, created all things. He did not invoke Poseidon or any water deity. He simply observed that water could take different forms, that it could be liquid, solid as ice, or vapor as steam. He noticed that living things seem to require moisture to thrive, that seeds need water to germinate, that life appears wherever water flows and vanishes where drought prevails. He may have observed fossils of sea creatures far inland and reasoned that the seas must once have covered the land. From these observations, he concluded that water itself, not as a god but as a physical substance, was the primary principle from which all things emerged and to which all things might return. This might not sound like much to modern ears, but consider what Thales had done. He had proposed a natural explanation for the origin and constitution of the world. He had suggested that beneath the apparent diversity of things, beneath the endless variety of substances and forms we encounter, there was a single, unified principle that could be discovered through reason and observation. He had opened a door through which countless others would follow, each proposing their own theories, each building on or arguing against what came before. The student and successor of Thales, at least according to ancient tradition, was Anaximander, another citizen of Miletus. Anaximander looked at Thales's answer and found it wanting. If everything came from water, he reasoned, then why are there things that seem opposed to water, like fire? How could a single element be the source of all the opposing qualities we observe in nature? Hot and cold, wet and dry, light and dark. there must be something more fundamental, something that could give rise to all these opposites without itself being any particular one of them. Anaximander proposed that the arche was something he called the apeion, a Greek word meaning the boundless, the unlimited, or the indefinite. This was not a physical substance you could touch or see. It was more like an infinite reservoir of potential, a cosmic source that contained all possibilities. From this boundless origin, Anaximander imagined, pairs of opposites separated out, hot and cold, wet and dry. These opposites then combined and recombined to form the world we experience. Earth, air, fire, and water all emerged from the apeion, and they existed in a constant cycle of creation and destruction, each encroaching upon the others, paying penalty and retribution for their injustices according to the order of time. Anaximander's universe was dynamic, governed by a kind of cosmic justice. When summer's heat dominates, it commits an injustice against the cold, and so winter must come to restore balance. When drought prevails, the rains return as retribution. The world was a place of constant flux and transformation, held together not by the will of gods, but by an impersonal principle of balance and order. This idea of natural law, of a cosmos governed by rational principles rather than divine whim, was staggering in its implications. Anaximander also speculated about the shape of Earth, imagining it as a cylinder floating freely in space, held in place not by Atlas or any mythological support, but by its equal distance from all points of the celestial sphere. He pondered the origin of living things, suggesting that life first arose from moisture, and that humans might have evolved from fish-like creatures. These speculations, though they would not be confirmed for more than 2 millennia, show the audacious reach of early philosophical thinking. The third of the great Milesian thinkers was Anaximenes, who returned to the idea that the ark must be a physical substance, but chose air rather than water. For Anaximenes, air had certain advantages as a first principle. Like water, it could change form, but even more dramatically. When rarefied, air became fire. When condensed, it became wind, then cloud, then water, then earth, then stone. All of substance was just air in various states of condensation and rarefaction. And air had another quality that made it seem fundamental. It was associated with breath, with life itself. The Greek word for air, aer, was closely related to the word for soul or breath, psyche. To breathe was to live, and the air we breathed seemed to connect us to the atmosphere that surrounded the world. The cosmos itself seemed to breathe. These 3 Milesians, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, established a way of thinking that would echo through the ages. They insisted that the world was knowable, that it operated according to principles that human reason could discover, and that these principles were natural rather than supernatural. They disagreed with one another, proposed competing theories, and in doing so demonstrated something equally important: that knowledge advances through debate, through the testing of ideas against observation and argument. They created not just answers, but a method for seeking answers. But philosophy was not only emerging in Miletus. Across the Greek world, other voices were rising, asking their own questions, proposing their own visions of reality. In Ephesus, a city not far from Miletus, there lived a philosopher who would become known as Heraclitus the Obscure, or sometimes Heraclitus the Dark. He earned this epithet because his sayings were notoriously cryptic, written in riddling epigrams that demanded careful thought to unpack. He was said to be proud, melancholic, and contemptuous of other thinkers. While Democritus was known as the laughing philosopher, Heraclitus was remembered as the weeping philosopher, perpetually dismayed by the ignorance he saw around him. Heraclitus looked at the Milesian philosophers and saw that they were grasping at something important but missing the deeper truth. Yes, there was an underlying unity to reality. But the Milesians had imagined this unity as static, as a stable substance that simply took different forms. Heraclitus insisted that reality was not a thing but a process. The fundamental nature of existence was not being but becoming, not stability but change. His most famous saying captures this insight perfectly. You cannot step into the same river twice. At first, this seems like a simple observation about rivers. The water flows, so the river you step into now is not the same water you would step into a moment later. But Heraclitus meant something more profound. The river itself, as a coherent entity, only exists because water is constantly flowing through it. If the water stopped moving, it would cease to be a river and become a pond or lake. The river's very identity is the process of change, and the same is true of everything. We ourselves are like rivers. The matter that composes our bodies is constantly being replaced. Cells die and are renewed. Atoms are exchanged with our environment. What makes us us is not some unchanging substance, but a pattern, a process, maintained through constant transformation. For Heraclitus, the fundamental element that best represented this principle of constant change was fire. Fire is never static. It must consume to exist. It transforms everything it touches, turning wood into ash and smoke. But in doing so, it reveals the deeper unity of things. Heraclitus wrote, "This world order, the same for all. No god nor man did create, but it ever was and is and will be. Ever-living fire, kindling in measures, and being quenched in measures. The cosmos itself was like a great fire, eternally burning, eternally transforming, held together not by some underlying substance, but by a pattern of change. But if everything is constantly changing, how can there be any order or stability?" Heraclitus answered with the concept of logos, a Greek word rich with meanings. Word, proportion, reason, principle. The logos was the underlying pattern, the rational structure that governed the transformations of the cosmos. It was the hidden harmony that made change itself orderly rather than chaotic. He wrote, "Listening not to me but to the logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one." The logos manifested itself through what Heraclitus called the unity of opposites, hot and cold, wet and dry, day and night, life and death. These were not separate, independent things, but aspects of a single underlying process. They defined each other, transformed into each other, and through their strife created the harmony of the cosmos. The path up and the path down are one and the same, he wrote. Opposites were not contradictory but complementary, two sides of one reality. Heraclitus saw conflict not as something to be lamented, but as the very engine of existence. War is the father of all and king of all, he declared. Not literal warfare, but the productive tension between opposites. The strife that generates change and transformation. Without this tension, without opposition and difference, nothing could exist or become. The bow and the lyre, he noted, create their beauty through tension. The string pulled taut against the wood, ready to release its potential as an arrow's flight or a musical note. Yet despite the centrality of change to Heraclitus's philosophy, very few people, he claimed, truly understood the logos. Most people sleepwalked through life, oblivious to the deeper patterns governing existence. They thought their private interpretations of reality were true, when in fact the logos was common to all, the shared rationale structure of the cosmos that only the wise could apprehend. The philosopher's task was to wake up, to become alert to the logos, to see through the surface appearances to the underlying unity and process. While Heraclitus was proclaiming that all things flow and change, another philosopher was developing a vision of reality that seemed to be the exact opposite. His name was Parmenides, and he came from Elea, a Greek colony in southern Italy. If Heraclitus emphasized becoming, Parmenides would emphasize being. If Heraclitus saw the world as fire and flux, Parmenides would argue that true reality was utterly unchanging. Parmenides expressed his philosophy in a poem, of which only fragments survive. In it, he describes being led by a goddess down two paths, the way of truth and the way of opinion. The way of opinion is the path ordinary mortals follow, trusting their senses, believing that things come into being and pass away, that the world is full of change and multiplicity. But the goddess tells Parmenides that this is a mere illusion, a deceptive appearance. The way of truth, the path of reason, leads to a startling conclusion. What is, what is not, and it is impossible for what is not to be, or for what is to not be. This might sound like an empty tautology, but Parmenides drew profound conclusions from it. If something truly is, he reasoned, it cannot have come into being, because that would require it to come from what is not, which is impossible. It cannot pass away, because that would mean it becomes what is not. Equally impossible. Therefore, what truly exists must be eternal, without beginning or end. Furthermore, if what is, then it cannot change, because change implies that something that was one way is now another way. But that would mean something that was is now not, which contradicts the principle that what is must be. Therefore, reality must be unchanging, immutable, and if what is exists, it cannot be divided or have parts, because the divisions would be places where being is separated by non-being, which cannot exist. Therefore, reality must be a single, undivided whole, continuous and complete. And finally, reality cannot move, because motion requires empty space to move into, but empty space is non-being, which does not exist. Therefore, reality is motionless. The result of Parmenides' relentless logic was a vision of reality as a perfect, unchanging, eternal, indivisible sphere of being. Everything our senses tell us, that things change, move, come to be and pass away, is mere illusion, the way of opinion. True reality, accessible only to reason, is absolutely static and unchanging. This was philosophical reasoning at its most austere and uncompromising. Parmenides trusted logic over experience, reason over sensation, and his arguments were so powerful, so difficult to refute, that they cast a long shadow over all subsequent Greek philosophy. Every thinker who came after had to grapple with Parmenides, either trying to refute him, reconcile him with experience, or accept his radical conclusions. One of Parmenides' followers was Zeno of Elea, who defended his master's doctrines with a series of ingenious paradoxes designed to show that the common-sense belief in motion and plurality led to logical contradictions. The most famous is the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine Achilles, the swift hero, racing against a tortoise and giving the tortoise a head start. To catch the tortoise, Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise was when he started. But by the time he reaches that point, the tortoise has moved a little further ahead. So Achilles must reach that new point. But again, by the time he does, the tortoise has moved a bit more. This process continues infinitely. Achilles is always reaching where the tortoise was, never where the tortoise is. Therefore, Zeno concluded, swift Achilles can never overtake the plodding tortoise. Of course, we know from experience that faster runners do overtake slower ones. Zeno's point was precisely that our experience contradicts the logic of motion. If we trust our senses, we believe motion is real. But if we trust our reason, following the logic of infinite divisibility, we find that motion is impossible. The paradoxes were not meant to be solved, but to demonstrate that the world of appearance, the world of motion and change that Heraclitus celebrated, was rationally incoherent. The power of Parmenides' and Zeno's arguments created a crisis in Greek philosophy. How could one reconcile the evidence of the senses, which clearly showed a world of change and motion, with the seemingly irrefutable logic that proved change was impossible? The philosophers who came after Parmenides, often called the pluralists, sought to honor both the logical power of his arguments and the obvious fact that the world does change. They accepted Parmenides' claim that what truly is cannot come into being or pass away. But they proposed that reality was composed not of one unchanging being, but of many such beings, multiple fundamental elements or particles that were themselves eternal and unchanging, but could combine and separate to create the appearance of change. Empedocles of Acragas, a city in Sicily, was both a philosopher and something of a mystic, claiming to be a god walking among mortals. He proposed that there were 4 fundamental elements, or, as he called them, 4 roots: earth, air, fire, and water. These four roots were eternal and unchangeable in themselves, but they could mix together in different proportions to create all the various substances we observe. What we call generation was really just mixture, and what we call destruction was really separation. Nothing truly came into being or passed away. Things only combined and recombined. But what caused these combinations and separations? Empedocles introduced two cosmic forces, love and strife. Love was the force that brought things together, that mixed and unified. Strife was the force that separated and divided. The history of the cosmos was a great cycle. Love gradually brings all things together into a perfect sphere where the four roots are completely mixed. Then strife begins to separate them, creating the world of distinct objects and beings. Eventually, strife completely separates everything, and then love begins to bring things together again. This cosmic cycle repeated eternally. Empedocles' vision was simultaneously scientific and mythological. The four roots would become the four classical elements that dominated Western thought until the scientific revolution. But love and strife retained a poetic, almost divine quality. They were personified forces, cosmic principles that transcended mere mechanical causation. Another response to Parmenides came from Anaxagoras of Clazomenae. Anaxagoras agreed that the truly real must be eternal, but he took pluralism even further than Empedocles. Instead of four roots, Anaxagoras proposed an infinite number of fundamental stuffs. Everything we experience, he claimed, was a mixture of tiny seeds or portions of every possible substance. A piece of gold contained not just gold but imperceptibly small amounts of every other substance. What made it appear as gold was simply that gold predominated in the mixture. How did these mixtures form? Anaxagoras introduced the concept of nous, often translated as mind or intelligence. Nous was not material, but was the organizing principle of the cosmos. Originally, all the seeds were mixed together in a uniform chaos. Then nous initiated a cosmic vortex, a great whirling motion that began to separate things out, bringing like to like, creating the ordered cosmos we inhabit. Nous knew all things and had power over all things. It was separate from matter, pure, unmixed. This introduction of mind as a cosmic principle was momentous. Earlier philosophers had sought to explain everything through material causes: water, air, fire, the boundless. Anaxagoras suggested that intelligence, purpose, organization were also fundamental features of reality. This idea would have profound influence on later thinkers, especially Plato and Aristotle, even though they criticized Anaxagoras for not making greater use of nous in his explanations. But perhaps the most influential response to Parmenides came from two philosophers, Leucippus and Democritus, who developed the theory of atomism. Very little is known about Leucippus, and his ideas are often indistinguishable from those of his follower Democritus. Together, they proposed a solution to Parmenides's paradoxes that was as elegant as it was radical. They accepted Parmenides's that what truly is cannot come into being, pass away, or change. But they proposed that reality consisted of an infinite number of tiny, indivisible particles. Atoms, from the Greek atomos, meaning uncuttable. These atoms were eternal, unchanging, solid particles that differed only in shape, size, and arrangement. They moved through an infinite void, empty space that Parmenides had declared impossible, but which the atomists insisted must exist for motion to be possible. The void was a kind of non-being, but it was real. It was not nothing in an absolute sense, but rather no thing, the absence of matter, but not the absence of space. This was a subtle but crucial distinction. By accepting the reality of the void, the atomists could explain motion. Atoms moved through empty space, colliding with one another, combining into larger structures breaking apart, eternally in motion. Everything we experience, all the rich diversity of the world, arose from the movements and combinations of atoms. The soul itself was made of particularly fine, smooth atoms. Thought was a physical process, the movement of soul atoms within us. There were no gods directing the cosmos, no divine purpose. Everything happened by necessity, as atoms moved and collided according to their nature. The universe was a vast mechanism, eternal and uncreated, governed by natural law. This was materialism in its purest form. Nothing existed but atoms and the void. All qualities we experience, color, taste, smell, texture, were not the properties of the atoms themselves, but arose from how atoms interacted with our sense organs. As Democritus put it, by convention sweet, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color. But in reality, atoms and void. The atomists' vision was strikingly modern. Though they lacked any empirical evidence for atoms, their theory anticipated in remarkable ways the atomic theory that would emerge more than 2 millennia later. But in their own time, atomism was controversial, even disturbing. It left no room for divine providence, for purpose, for the kind of cosmic order that gave comfort and meaning. The universe of the atomists was beautiful in its simplicity, but cold in its implications. Before we continue deeper into the classical period of Greek philosophy, we must pause to consider one more pre-Socratic figure whose influence was profound and multifaceted: Pythagoras of Samos. Pythagoras is a strange figure in the history of philosophy, wrapped in legend and mystery. He wrote nothing, or if he did, none of it survives. What we know comes from later sources, many of them written centuries after his death. And it is often impossible to separate what Pythagoras himself taught from what his followers added. Ancient authors disagreed about whether he was a serious philosopher or a charlatan, a mathematical genius, or a mystical cult leader. Perhaps he was all of these things. Pythagoras was born on the island of Samos around 570 before the Common Era and eventually settled in Croton, a Greek city in southern Italy, where he established a community that was part philosophical school, part religious sect, part political movement. The Pythagoreans lived according to strict rules. They followed a vegetarian diet, believing in the transmigration of souls and thus regarding all living things as kin. They observed various ritual prohibitions, some of which seem bizarre to us. Don't eat beans. Don't stir fire with iron. Don't look in a mirror beside a light. The reasons for these taboos are lost, though scholars speculate they had symbolic or religious significance. The Pythagorean community was structured hierarchically. New members went through years of probation, during which they had to remain silent, simply listening to the master's teachings. They were called the akousmatikoi, the listeners. Only after proving themselves could they become the mathematikoi, the learners, who were permitted to ask questions and participate in discussions. This structure reflected the Pythagorean belief that wisdom required a discipline and gradual initiation into deeper mysteries. The community held a property in common and shared meals together. They believed in equality between men and women in philosophical matters, unusual for ancient Greece. Several women were noted Pythagoreans, including Theano, who was either Pythagoras' wife or student or both, and who may have continued teaching after his death. The Pythagoreans saw themselves as a brotherhood, bound by secrecy and mutual obligation. They had recognition signals, special symbols they could use to identify fellow members when traveling, and they maintained loyalty to one another across great distances. But alongside these mystical and religious practices, the Pythagoreans engaged in serious mathematical and musical studies. They discovered the mathematical ratios underlying musical harmony, that a string half the length of another produces a note 1 octave higher, that the ratio 3:2 produces a fifth, 4:3 a fourth. These simple numerical ratios created the consonant intervals that made music beautiful. The Pythagoreans were stunned by this discovery. It suggested that numbers were not mere abstractions, but the very essence of reality, the underlying structure of the cosmos. They extended this insight, seeking numerical patterns everywhere. They studied geometry, and to them is attributed the famous Pythagorean theorem, though it's unclear whether Pythagoras himself discovered it or merely transmitted knowledge from Babylonian sources. They speculated about the heavens, imagining that the celestial bodies, sun, moon, planets, and stars, moved in perfect circular orbits, creating a cosmic music, the harmony of the spheres, inaudible to mortal ears, but structuring all existence. The Pythagorean doctrine can be summarized in the phrase, "all is number." By this, they meant that the principles of mathematics were the principles of all things. Numbers were not merely tools for counting, but the fundamental constituents of reality. The number 1 represented unity, wholeness, the divine. 2 represented duality, division, the female principle. 3 represented harmony, the reconciliation of opposites, the male principle. 4 was justice, solid and square. 10 was perfection, the tetractys, the sum of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, the sacred number by which the Pythagoreans swore their oaths. This mathematical mysticism may seem strange, but it contained the seed of a profound insight, that the universe is structured according to rational, mathematical principles that the human mind can comprehend. This idea would inspire centuries of scientific investigation. When Galileo declared that the book of nature was written in the language of mathematics, he was echoing, however distantly, the Pythagorean vision. The Pythagoreans also believed in the immortality of the soul and its transmigration. The soul, they taught, was not the body's prisoner, but a divine spark that went through cycles of incarnation, dwelling in human and animal bodies, even plants. The goal of life was to purify the soul through philosophy and right living, so that eventually it might escape the cycle of rebirth and return to the divine realm. This belief connected Pythagoreanism to the mystery religions of Greece, especially Orphism, and it introduced into Greek philosophy a dualism between body and soul, matter and spirit, that would have lasting influence, especially on Plato. Now, let your mind drift forward in time, from the coasts of Ionia and the cities of southern Italy to Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era. Athens had become the intellectual center of the Greek world, a vibrant democracy where free men gathered in the agora to debate politics, where dramatists staged tragedies and comedies that explored the deepest questions of human existence, where sophists traveled from city to city teaching rhetoric and philosophy for pay. Into this bustling, argumentative city came a peculiar man named Socrates. He was not handsome. Ancient sources describe him as snub-nosed, with bulging eyes and a pot-belly. He went barefoot even in winter, and wore the same simple cloak day after day. He had no regular employment, but spent his days in the marketplace, the gymnasia, the workshops, wherever people gathered, engaging anyone who would listen in philosophical conversation. Socrates claimed to know nothing. Unlike the sophists who professed expertise in virtue, justice, and political wisdom, Socrates insisted he possessed no wisdom at all. Yet the oracle at Delphi, when asked if anyone was wiser than Socrates, answered that none was wiser. Puzzled by this pronouncement, Socrates set out to test it. He sought out people with reputations for wisdom, politicians, poets, craftsmen, and questioned them about their areas of supposed expertise. What he discovered was that though these people thought they knew important things, upon examination their knowledge proved hollow. They could not give coherent accounts of justice, piety, courage, or any of the virtues they claimed to possess. Socrates concluded that the oracle's meaning was this: he was wisest because he at least knew that he knew nothing, while others were ignorant of their own ignorance. This realization became the foundation of Socrates' philosophical mission. He saw himself as a gadfly, stinging the great horse that was Athens into wakefulness. He challenged conventional opinions, especially those concerning moral and political matters. He forced his interlocutors to examine their assumptions, to define their terms, to follow the logic of their beliefs wherever it led. More often than not, these conversations ended in aporia, a state of puzzlement and confusion, with the original claim thoroughly refuted but no clear answer to replace it. Socrates. His questioning was not arbitrary or destructive. It followed a pattern, a method that has been studied and imitated ever since. He would typically begin by asking for a definition of some important concept, usually a virtue. What is courage? Someone might answer, courage is standing one's ground in battle. Socrates would then point out that this is merely an example of courage, not a definition of what courage is. The person might try again. Courage is endurance of the soul. Socrates would then ask, is all endurance courage? What about foolish endurance? Someone persisting in a harmful course of action through sheer stubbornness. That doesn't seem courageous. So perhaps courage is wise endurance. But what makes endurance wise? And aren't there other virtues that involve wise endurance, like temperance? So how is courage different? Through this process, Socrates would show that what seemed obvious and simple was actually deeply puzzling. The definitions that ordinary language provided so easily dissolved under examination. Yet Socrates believed this process was valuable, even essential. By exposing the inadequacy of conventional thinking, he created space for genuine understanding to emerge. He was clearing away the weeds of false opinion so that true knowledge might take root. The Socratic method, as this approach came to be called, was simultaneously humbling and empowering. It showed that most people, even those with reputations for wisdom, didn't really understand the things they talked about with such confidence. But it also demonstrated that through patient questioning and honest dialogue, people could make progress toward truth. Socrates had faith in the power of reason and in the capacity of human beings to improve their understanding through cooperative inquiry. Socrates also employed what came to be called the method of hypothesis. When investigating a question, he would propose a hypothesis and then examine its implications. If the implications led to contradictions or absurd conclusions, the hypothesis would be rejected, and a new one would be tried. This process of elimination gradually narrowed the field of possibilities, moving closer to truth even if final truth remained elusive. His conversations often involved analogies and comparisons. If someone claimed that justice meant helping friends and harming enemies, Socrates might ask, does a just person make people more just or more unjust? Surely more just. But if we harm someone, don't we make them worse? And doesn't making people worse mean making them more unjust? So a just person, by definition, someone who makes others more just, would never deliberately harm anyone, even an enemy. Through such reasoning, Socrates would overturn conventional wisdom and point toward deeper truths. Central to Socrates' philosophy was his conception of the soul. For most Greeks, the soul or psyche was associated with life and vitality, something that departed at death. But Socrates gave it deeper significance. The soul was the seat of consciousness, personality, moral character, everything that made a person who they really were. Your body might be healthy or sick, beautiful or plain, but these were external matters. What truly mattered was the state of your soul. Caring for the soul meant cultivating virtue, pursuing wisdom, examining one's life. It meant being more concerned with being good than with appearing good, more interested in what is true than in what is popular or profitable. Socrates saw most people as living inverted lives, valuing the wrong things. They pursued wealth, power, pleasure, and reputation while neglecting justice, wisdom, and the health of their souls. It was as if they spent all their time polishing their shoes while ignoring a fatal illness. The method Socrates employed came to be called the elenchus, a form of cross-examination. He would begin by asking his interlocutor to define some virtue. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? the person would offer a definition. Socrates would then ask clarifying questions, draw out implications, propose counterexamples, until the definition collapsed into contradiction. A new definition would be offered, and the process would repeat. Through this dialectical questioning, Socrates aimed not to humiliate but to purify, to strip away false opinions so that truth might have a chance to emerge. Socrates also described himself as a midwife. Just as his mother Phaenarete helped women give birth, Socrates helped men give birth to ideas. He had no doctrines of his own to teach, but helped others bring forth the knowledge latent within them. This maieutic method, as it was called, assumed that truth was not something imported from outside, but something discovered within, through careful questioning and self-examination. The examined life, Socrates insisted, was the only life worth living. Most people drifted through existence absorbed in the pursuit of wealth, pleasure, and reputation, never pausing to ask what truly mattered, whether their values were sound, whether they were living well or merely living. Philosophy, for Socrates, was not an academic exercise but a way of life, a commitment to self-knowledge and moral seriousness. Central to Socrates' thought was the connection between knowledge and virtue. He held that no one does wrong willingly. If a person truly knew what was good, he would choose it. All wrongdoing, therefore, stems from ignorance. Virtue is knowledge. To know the good is to do the good. This claim, paradoxical on its face, surely people sometimes know what's right and still do what's wrong, became known as the Socratic paradox. But Socrates was working with a deeper notion of knowledge than mere intellectual understanding. To truly know the good meant to grasp it with one's whole being, to see it so clearly and completely that one could not help but pursue it. Socrates also believed that the soul was more valuable than the body, that caring for one's soul, cultivating wisdom, justice, and virtue was the most important task of life. The soul, for Socrates, was the seat of one's personality, one's moral character, one's true self. To neglect the soul in favor of bodily pleasures or external goods was to betray one's own humanity. His relentless questioning, his challenges to traditional piety and conventional morality, eventually made Socrates dangerous enemies. In 399 before the Common Era, when Socrates was 70 years old, he was brought to trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. The charges were vague but serious. He was accused of not believing in the gods of the city and introducing new deities and of leading young men astray with his teachings. At his trial, Socrates refused to play the role of the humble defendant begging for mercy. Instead, he defended his philosophical mission. He told the jury that he was a gift to Athens, sent by the gods to rouse the city from complacency. Far from deserving punishment, he argued, he deserved to be honored and maintained at public expense. This defiant stance did not endear him to the jury. He was convicted by a narrow majority and sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. Even in prison, awaiting execution, Socrates continued to philosophize. His friends urged him to escape. They had bribed the guards, made all the arrangements. But Socrates refused. To flee would be to violate the laws of Athens, laws he had tacitly agreed to obey by living his entire life as an Athenian citizen. To break the law now, even an unjust law, would be to betray his own principles, to harm his soul. Better to die justly than live unjustly. On his last day, surrounded by friends, Socrates drank the poison calmly. He spoke of his hope that the soul was immortal, that death was not the end but a transition. He faced his death without fear, maintaining his composure and good humor to the very end. His final words, as recorded by Plato, were, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Make sure the debt is paid." Even this enigmatic last utterance has been interpreted as philosophically significant. Asclepius was the god of healing, and perhaps Socrates meant that death was a healing, a release of the soul from the body's illnesses. The death of Socrates became one of the defining moments in Western philosophy. It demonstrated the philosopher's commitment to truth and virtue, above all else, even life itself. And it inspired his followers, especially Plato, to devote themselves to preserving and extending Socrates' philosophical project. Plato was born into an aristocratic Athenian family around 427 before the Common Era. His real name was Aristocles. Plato was a nickname, possibly referring to his broad physique. In his youth, he was athletic and gifted, winning prizes in wrestling. He seemed destined for a political career, the natural path for someone of his class and talents. But he fell under the spell of Socrates, and philosophy claimed him instead. The death of Socrates shattered Plato's faith in Athenian democracy. How could the city have condemned such a man? How could the majority, supposedly wise in matters of state, have made such a terrible error? Plato concluded that the problem lay in democracy itself, in the principle that political power should be distributed equally among all citizens regardless of their wisdom or virtue. After Socrates' death, Plato left Athens for several years, traveling to Megara, possibly Egypt and Sicily. He was seeking wisdom, studying with other philosophers, and wrestling with the questions Socrates had raised. When Plato returned to Athens, he founded the Academy, a school dedicated to philosophical education. It would endure for nearly 900 years, until finally closed by the Christian Emperor Justinian in the 6th century of the Common Era, making it one of the longest-lived educational institutions in history. At the Academy, students studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, engaging in dialectical discussion and seeking to understand the deepest nature of reality. The Academy was located in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, northwest of Athens. Over its entrance, tradition says, was inscribed, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." Mathematics was considered essential preparation for philosophy because it trained the mind in abstract reasoning and revealed eternal truths. The Pythagorean influence was strong. Students would study arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the quadrivium of mathematical sciences, before moving on to dialectic, the highest form of philosophical inquiry. At the Academy, knowledge was pursued cooperatively. Students and teachers engaged in dialogues, following arguments wherever they led. There were no textbooks in the modern sense, no systematic lectures laying out Platonic doctrine. Instead, there was inquiry, questioning, the examination of problems from multiple angles. Plato himself never appears as a character in his own dialogues, speaking in his own voice. He presents ideas dramatically, through conversations between characters, leaving readers to work out the implications themselves. This method was deliberate. Plato believed that genuine understanding couldn't be transmitted like information poured from one vessel into another. Each person had to discover truth for themselves through the hard work of thinking. The dialogues were meant to provoke thought, not to provide easy answers. They modeled the process of philosophical inquiry, showing how to question, how to follow an argument, how to recognize and avoid fallacies. Plato wrote his dialogues over many decades, and scholars detect an evolution in his thought. The early dialogues, such as the Euthyphro, Apology, and Credo, are relatively short and focus on ethical questions, typically ending in aporia without definitive answers. These are generally thought to represent Socrates' own philosophy fairly closely. Plato was still working out what he'd learned from his master, preserving Socrates' method and concerns. The middle dialogues, including the Phaedo, Symposium, Republic, and Phaedrus, are longer and more ambitious. Here, Plato develops his own distinctive doctrines, especially the theory of forms. Socrates remains the main character, but the ideas expressed are recognized as Plato's own. These dialogues are constructive, proposing theories and offering arguments for them, though still in dramatic dialogue form. The late dialogues, such as the Parmenides, Theaetetus, Sophist, and Laws, show Plato engaging in critical examination of his own earlier positions. In the Parmenides, for instance, he presents devastating objections to the theory of forms through the character of the elderly Parmenides, questioning a young Socrates. Whether Plato intended these objections to refute his theory or to refine it remains debated. The late dialogues are more technical, more concerned with logical and metaphysical puzzles, and sometimes Socrates plays a smaller role or doesn't appear at all. The theory of forms itself underwent development and refinement. In its mature form, as presented in dialogues like the Republic and Phaedo, the forms constituted a complete metaphysical system. They were organized hierarchically. At the bottom were forms of artifacts and particular things. Above these were forms of natural kinds, the forms of living things, of elements, of natural phenomena. Higher still were mathematical forms, the form of triangle, the form of number. Then came the forms of virtues and abstract qualities, justice, beauty, wisdom. And at the pinnacle stood the form of the good, the source of being and intelligibility for all other forms. The form of the good was special. It was not simply one form among others, but the principle that made all the others possible. Just as the sun in the visible world provides light that makes things visible, and provides life that makes things grow, the form of the good in the intelligible realm provides truth that makes things knowable, and being that makes things real. To understand the form of the good was to achieve the highest knowledge, and only those who attained this understanding were fit to rule the ideal state. But how do we come to know the forms, if they exist in a transcendent realm beyond sensory experience? Plato's answer involved the doctrine of recollection or anamnesis. The soul, he believed, was immortal and had existed before being born into a body. In its disembodied state, it had direct acquaintance with the forms. Birth was a kind of forgetting, a fall into the confused world of sensation and opinion. But traces of the soul's original knowledge remained, and through philosophical inquiry, these could be recalled. Learning, then, was really a kind of remembering. When a geometry student grasps that the angles of a triangle sum to 2 right angles, they're not receiving new information from outside, but awakening knowledge that was always within them. Socrates demonstrated this in the Meno, where he led an uneducated slave boy to discover a geometrical truth through careful questioning without teaching him anything directly. The boy already knew the truth. He just needed to be reminded of it. This theory had profound implications. If learning is recollection, then the soul must have existed before birth. And if the soul could survive the death of one body and be born into another, perhaps it could survive future deaths as well, making it essentially immortal. Plato offered several arguments for the soul's immortality in different dialogues. The soul is simple and uncompounded, he argued, and therefore cannot decompose. It is self-moving, the source of motion and life, and therefore cannot cease to exist. It apprehends eternal truths, and therefore must itself be eternal. In the Phaedo, set on the last day of Socrates' life, Plato explores the relationship between soul and body more deeply. The body, with its appetites and vulnerabilities, is a distraction and burden for the philosopher. It demands food, comfort, and pleasure, pulling the soul away from contemplation of eternal truths. The senses provide confused and contradictory information. True knowledge requires turning away from the body, withdrawing into pure thought. Death, then, is not something to fear, but something the philosopher has been practicing for his whole life: the separation of soul from body, the liberation of the mind from physical concerns. This dualism between soul and body, between the eternal realm of forms and the transient material world, was one of Plato's most influential contributions to Western thought. It shaped Christian theology, which adopted and adapted Platonic ideas about the soul, immortality, and a transcendent realm of perfection. It influenced the development of science, which sought eternal mathematical laws beneath the flux of phenomena. It shaped art and aesthetics, which distinguished between mere imitation of appearances and the representation of ideal beauty. In the Symposium, Plato explored the nature of love and its relationship to philosophy. The dialogue is set at a drinking party where each guest gives a speech praising Eros, the god of love. The speeches progress from crude to sophisticated, culminating in Socrates' account of a teaching he received from a wise woman named Diotima. According to Diotima, love is desire for what one lacks. We love beautiful things because we desire beauty. But physical beauty is transient and individual. A philosophical person begins to recognize that different beautiful things share something in common, that they all participate in beauty itself. The lover of wisdom ascends a ladder, starting from love of one beautiful body, then recognizing beauty in all bodies, then in beautiful souls. then in beautiful practices and laws, then in beautiful knowledge, until finally reaching beauty itself, the form of beauty, eternal and perfect. This ascent of love becomes an ascent to philosophical understanding. Eros, desire, is what drives the soul upward toward the forms. Philosophy itself is described as a kind of erotic pursuit, a passionate longing for wisdom and truth. The philosopher is not someone who already possesses wisdom. The gods possess wisdom and don't need to seek it, but someone who loves wisdom, who desires it intensely and pursues it devotedly. The Republic, Plato's longest and most influential dialogue, weaves together many of these themes. It begins as an investigation of justice, but expands into a comprehensive vision of the ideal state, the proper education of guardians, the nature of reality, the power of poetry, and the destiny of the soul. The dialogue is structured as a conversation between Socrates and various interlocutors, but it unfolds like a philosophical symphony, with themes introduced, developed, and brought together in harmonious unity. The famous allegory of the divided line presented in the Republic illustrates the relationship between different levels of reality and corresponding forms of cognition. Plato asks us to imagine a line divided into 4 segments. The lowest segment represents mere images, shadows, reflections, appearances. The next segment up represents physical objects, the things that cast those shadows. These 2 segments together make up the visible realm. Above this is the intelligible realm, also divided into 2 segments. The lower intelligible segment represents mathematical objects and hypotheses, things we reason about but don't directly perceive. The highest segment represents the forms themselves, especially the form of the good, known through pure philosophical understanding. Each segment has a corresponding mental state. Looking at shadows and images produces imagination or conjecture. Perceiving physical objects produces belief or confidence. Reasoning about mathematics produces thought or understanding. And grasping the forms through dialectic produces knowledge or wisdom. The philosopher's task is to ascend from the lowest level to the highest, from mere opinion about shadows to genuine knowledge of eternal truth. Plato's philosophical vision emerged from his attempt to answer questions Socrates had raised but left unresolved. If Socrates was right that virtue is knowledge, what exactly is it that we need to know? What is justice itself, courage itself, piety itself? When we call multiple things just or beautiful or good, what makes them all instances of the same quality? Socrates had spent his life seeking definitions of the virtues, but never arrived at final answers. Plato believed he had discovered the answer, and it would become his most famous and influential contribution to philosophy: the theory of forms, or theory of ideas. Imagine 2 beautiful objects, a sunset painting the sky in brilliant colors, and a mathematical proof of elegant simplicity. These are very different kinds of things, yet we call both beautiful. What do they have in common? Not any physical property, since one is a natural phenomenon, and the other an abstract structure. Plato's answer was that they both participate in the form of beauty, an eternal, unchanging, perfect standard of beauty that exists in a realm beyond the physical world. The forms, or ideas, were for Plato the ultimate reality. Everything we perceive with our senses is imperfect, changeable, and finite. But the forms are perfect, eternal, and unchanging. There is a form of justice, a form of courage, a form of the good, forms of all abstract qualities. There are even forms of natural kinds, a form of horse, a form of tree. And at the pinnacle of this hierarchy of forms stands the form of the good, the source of all being, truth, and value. Physical objects are like shadows or reflections of the forms. A beautiful painting participates in the form of beauty, but is never perfectly beautiful. It might fade, be damaged, be judged differently by different viewers. The form of beauty, on the other hand, is beauty itself, perfect and complete, the standard against which all particular beautiful things are measured. The forms are what makes knowledge possible. We can have only opinion about the ever-changing world of sensory experience, but we can have genuine knowledge of the eternal forms. Plato illustrated this theory with his famous allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave since childhood, facing a wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners, seeing nothing else, believe the shadows are reality. If a prisoner were freed and turned around, the fire's light would hurt his eyes. If dragged outside the cave, the sunlight would be blinding. But gradually, his eyes would adjust. He would see the real objects, the sky, the stars, and finally the sun itself. Returning to the cave, he would try to tell the other prisoners about the real world above, but they would not believe him. The shadows would seem more real to them than his strange tales of things they'd never seen. The cave represents the physical world, the world of sensory experience. The shadows are the imperfect, changeable things we perceive. The journey out of the cave represents the philosopher's ascent to knowledge of the forms. The sun represents the form of the good, the ultimate source of truth and being. Most people remain prisoners, content with the shadows, mistaking appearance for reality. The philosopher is the one who escapes, who sees true reality, and who returns to try to enlighten others, often at great personal risk, just as Socrates had done. In the Republic, Plato's most ambitious dialogue, he used this theory to outline his vision of an ideal state. If knowledge is the key to virtue, and if philosophers are the ones who possess genuine knowledge by grasping the forms, then philosophers should rule. The ideal state would be governed by philosopher kings, individuals specially educated to understand the forms, particularly the form of the good, and thus capable of ruling justly and wisely. Plato's ideal state was divided into 3 classes, corresponding to 3 parts of the soul. At the top were the guardians or rulers, corresponding to the rational part of the soul. They would own no private property, share spouses and children communally, and devote themselves entirely to the good of the state. The second class were the auxiliaries or soldiers, corresponding to the spirited or courageous part of the soul. They would defend the state and enforce the ruler's decisions. The third class were the producers, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, corresponding to the appetitive part of the soul, concerned with physical needs and desires. Justice, both in the soul and in the state, consisted of each part performing its proper function in harmony with the others. Plato's Republic has been controversial since it was written. Some see it as a blueprint for totalitarianism, with its communism of property among the guardians, its censorship of poetry and art, its rigid class structure, its noble lie told to citizens to make them accept their station. Others see it as a utopian vision, an exploration of what a perfectly just society would look like if human nature could be perfected. Plato himself may have intended it more as an ideal model for thinking about justice than as a practical program for actual implementation. But the Republic contains far more than political philosophy. It includes extended discussions of education, art, the nature of the soul, and the immortality of the soul. Plato argued that the soul must be immortal because it is simple and unchanging, and only composite things that come together can fall apart. The soul, apprehending eternal forms, must itself be eternal. Plato explored the nature of love and beauty in the Symposium, desire and rhetoric in the Phaedrus, the relationship between soul and body in the Phaedo, the nature of knowledge in the Theaetetus, and countless other topics in his many dialogues. He wrote with literary brilliance, creating vivid characters, dramatic scenes, and arguments that have puzzled and inspired readers for over 2 millennia. One of those readers was a young man from Stagira, a small town in northern Greece. His name was Aristotle, and he would become Plato's most famous student, and eventually his most formidable critic. Aristotle arrived at Plato's academy at the age of 17 and remained for 20 years until Plato's death. He absorbed Plato's teachings deeply, but he also began to see problems with them. When Plato died, Aristotle left Athens, spent several years traveling and conducting biological research, and eventually tutored Alexander, who would become Alexander the Great, conqueror of the Persian Empire and spreader of the Greek culture across the known world. Aristotle's years away from Athens were formative. He lived on the island of Lesbos, where he conducted extensive biological research, dissecting animals, studying marine life in tidal pools, observing behavior patterns. This hands-on engagement with nature shaped his philosophical orientation. Unlike Plato, who tended toward mathematical abstraction and transcendent ideals, Aristotle was drawn to the particular, the concrete, the observable. He wanted to understand this world, not escape to another. During his time tutoring Alexander, Aristotle may have influenced the young prince's interest in natural history. Alexander's military campaigns would send back specimens and observations from across the known world, contributing to the ancient understanding of geography and biology. The relationship between philosopher and conqueror is fascinating to contemplate. Did Aristotle's teachings about the virtues influence Alexander's leadership? Did his ideas about politics shape how Alexander governed his empire? We can only speculate, but the connection reminds us that philosophy was never purely academic. It was meant to inform action in the world. After Alexander ascended to power, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum. He was called a peripatetic philosopher because he liked to teach while walking around the Lyceum's covered walkway, or peripatos. At the Lyceum, Aristotle and his students conducted research into every area of knowledge: logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry, biology, physics, astronomy, psychology. Aristotle was the first great systematizer of knowledge, organizing and categorizing the results of observation and reasoning into coherent structures. The Lyceum functioned differently from Plato's Academy. While the Academy emphasized mathematical studies and dialectical questioning, the Lyceum pursued empirical research and systematic classification. Aristotle organized collections of plant and animal specimens, gathered historical records and political constitutions from various cities, compiled the opinions of earlier philosophers, and encouraged his students to contribute to these ongoing research programs. It was an early version of what we might call a research university. Aristotle's writings that survive are quite different in character from Plato's dialogues. Instead of dramatic conversations, we have what appear to be lecture notes or treatises, dense, technical, systematic presentations of doctrines. They lack the literary grace of Plato's works but offer something else: comprehensive, organized accounts of entire fields of inquiry. It's as if we have Aristotle's course notes rather than the polished works he wrote for a general audience, which unfortunately have all been lost. Aristotle's disagreement with Plato centered on the theory of forms. Plato had placed the forms in a separate realm, transcendent and apart from the physical world. Aristotle found this unsatisfactory on multiple grounds. First, it seemed to multiply entities needlessly. Instead of just horses, we now had individual horses plus the form of horse. But this just pushed the question back. What explains the relationship between horses and the form? Plato posited participation, but what exactly did that mean? If individual horses participate in the form, isn't the form itself divided among them? But forms were supposed to be indivisible. The more Aristotle examined the theory, the more problems he found. Second, Aristotle questioned how transcendent forms could explain or cause anything in the physical world. If the form of horse exists in some separate realm, how does it help us understand why this particular horse grows, moves, reproduces, and eventually dies? The form was supposed to be eternal and unchanging, but horses undergo constant change. How could something static explain something dynamic? Third, Aristotle's empirical temperament rebelled against the idea that genuine knowledge required. Turning away from the sensory world toward pure abstractions, he believed the world we inhabit, the world we can observe and investigate, was itself worthy of understanding. We don't need to escape to a transcendent realm to achieve knowledge. The forms, patterns, and principles that make things what they are can be discovered right here, through careful observation and reasoning about experience. Aristotle proposed instead that the forms, which he called essences or species forms, existed within individual things, not in some separate realm. The essence of a horse was not something apart from horses, but was the principle that made each individual horse a horse, the pattern that shaped its matter and directed its development. When we identify something as a horse, we're recognizing this form or essence embodied in matter. This led to Aristotle's fundamental metaphysical distinction between matter and form, potentiality and actuality. Every physical substance, he argued, is a compound of matter and form. Matter is pure potentiality. It could become anything given the right form. Form is what actualizes that potentiality, making matter into something definite. A lump of bronze has the potential to become a statue, a sword, a shield. When the sculptor imposes form upon it, the potential becomes actual. But matter and form are relative concepts. The bronze statue has form as a statue, but bronze itself is a combination of more basic elements in a certain form, and those elements are matter capable of taking different forms. The hierarchy continues down to what Aristotle called prime matter, pure potentiality with no form at all, which can never exist independently, but is a useful theoretical concept. It continues upward to pure form with no matter, which Aristotle identified with God or the unmoved mover. Change, for Aristotle, always involved this interplay of potentiality and actuality. When an acorn becomes an oak tree, the potentiality present in the acorn becomes actualized. The form of oak tree was potentially present all along, and development consists in that potential being realized. This is very different from the atomist's view, where change is just atoms rearranging themselves with no inherent direction, and different from Plato's view, where change is a confused shadow of unchanging reality. To explain change more precisely, Aristotle introduced his famous theory of four causes. To truly understand why something is the way it is, you need to know four things. First, the material cause, what it's made of. Second, the formal cause, what kind of thing it is, its essence or defining pattern. Third, the efficient cause, what brought it into being, the agent or process responsible for the change. Fourth, the final cause, its purpose or end, its telos, what it's for or what it tends toward. Consider a human being. The material cause includes the flesh, blood, bones, and other physical constituents. The formal cause is the human essence, what makes a human human rather than some other kind of animal. The efficient cause includes the parents who generated this individual. And the final cause is the characteristic human activity, living according to reason, fulfilling human potential. For Aristotle, the final cause was especially important and often neglected. Everything in nature, he believed, had a purpose, a natural end toward which it tended. Acorns naturally develop into oak trees, not because of random chance, but because that's their telos. Heavy objects fall downward because Earth's natural place is at the center of the universe, and they're trying to reach it. Animals have instincts and behaviors that serve their survival and reproduction. Even non-living things have characteristic behaviors that reflect their natures. This teleological worldview was comprehensive. The cosmos itself was arranged hierarchically, with each thing having its proper place and function. Earth was at the center, surrounded by water, air, and fire in concentric spheres. Beyond these were the celestial spheres carrying the moon, sun, planets, and stars, all moving in perfect circles. At the outermost sphere was the unmoved mover, pure actuality, eternal thought thinking itself, drawing all things toward perfection through being the ultimate object of desire. This cosmic order was eternal. Aristotle denied that the universe had a beginning or would have an end. Species were fixed, having always existed as they are. Individual things came into being and passed away, but the forms or species themselves were eternal. This vision of a stable, hierarchical cosmos ordered by purpose and intelligence dominated Western thought until the scientific revolution. Aristotle's logic, systematized in works later collected as the Organon, was his most enduring contribution to philosophy. He essentially invented formal logic as a discipline. He analyzed arguments into premises and conclusions, identified valid and invalid forms of reasoning, and cataloged common fallacies. His theory of the syllogism, arguments with two premises and a conclusion, remained the core of logical education for 2 millennia. A categorical syllogism has this form: all A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. For example, all humans are immortal. Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Aristotle identified which combinations of premises could validly yield conclusions and which could not. He understood that validity was a matter of logical form, independent of content. The argument, all horses are immortal. Bucephalus is a horse. Therefore, Bucephalus is immortal is logically valid, even though its first premise is false. Validity concerns whether the conclusion follows from the premises, not whether the premises are true. This distinction between validity and truth, between logical form and factual content, was revolutionary. It allowed logic to develop as an abstract discipline, studying the structure of reasoning itself. Aristotle's logical works influenced medieval philosophy, Islamic philosophy, and remained standard until the development of modern symbolic logic in the 19th and 20th centuries. In metaphysics, Aristotle grappled with questions about being, substance, and the categories of existence. What makes something a thing, rather than a collection of the properties? What is the relationship between substance and attributes? Can something exist without existing as any particular kind of thing? These abstract questions had practical implications for how we understand and classify reality. Aristotle identified 10 categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and passion. Substance was primary, actual individual things like this horse or that tree. The other categories were ways substance could be modified or described. This horse has a quantity, its size. Qualities: brown, fast. Relations: larger than that pony, and so on. But underneath all these attributes is the substance itself, the basic entity that has these properties. His ethics, developed primarily in the Nicomachean ethics, began not with abstract principles but with observation of human life. What do people actually want? What are they aiming at? Ultimately, Aristotle concluded, everyone seeks eudaimonia, happiness, flourishing, living well. But what constitutes eudaimonia? Not mere pleasure, though pleasure accompanies it. Not wealth, which is only a means to other ends. not honor, which depends on others' opinions. Eudaimonia must be something final and self-sufficient, something chosen for its own sake. Aristotle's answer was that eudaimonia consists in activity in accordance with virtue. Human beings have a function, just as eyes have the function of seeing, and knives have the function of cutting. Our function is to exercise reason, our distinctive capacity. A good human life is one that exercises reason well, which means living virtuously. But virtue is not simply following rules. It's a disposition, a stable character trait developed through habituation. You become brave by doing brave acts, generous by doing generous acts, just by doing just acts. It's like learning to play a musical instrument. You can't become a skilled musician just by reading about music or understanding music theory. You have to practice over and over until playing well becomes natural, almost automatic. Moral virtue lies in the mean between extremes. Courage is the mean between cowardice, too little fear, and recklessness, too little appropriate caution. Generosity lies between stinginess and wastefulness. Proper pride lies between false humility and arrogance. But the mean is not mechanical or mathematical. It's relative to the situation and the person. What counts as generous depends on your resources, the recipient's needs, the occasion. Finding the mean requires practical wisdom, what Aristotle called phronesis. Phronesis is the intellectual virtue of knowing how to act well in particular situations. It requires experience, good judgment, sensitivity to context. The person of practical wisdom can perceive what matters in a situation, deliberate effectively about how to respond, and act appropriately. They've developed moral perception, the ability to see ethical dimensions of situations that others might miss. But practical wisdom is not the highest form of knowledge. Above it stands theoretical wisdom, or Sophia, the understanding of eternal truths through philosophical and scientific contemplation. The life of contemplation, devoted to understanding the deepest principles of reality, is the highest and happiest life. It's the closest humans can come to the divine activity of pure thought. Few people can sustain such a life entirely, but to whatever extent we can engage in contemplation, to that extent we participate in the highest happiness. Aristotle also wrote extensively on politics, which for the Greeks was inseparable from ethics. Humans are naturally political animals, he argued. We're not self-sufficient as individuals, but need communities to flourish. The household, the village, and ultimately the police or city-state are natural developments of human sociability. Politics is the study of how to organize these communities to promote human flourishing. Aristotle surveyed numerous constitutions, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses. He distinguished three good forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, polity, based on whether one person, a few people, or many people ruled for the common good. Each had a corrupt counterpart, where the rulers pursued their own interests rather than the common good. Tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Yes, Aristotle considered democracy a corrupt form of government, because he saw it as rule by the poor majority in their own interests, ignoring the good of the whole. The best practicable constitution, Aristotle thought, was a mixed form combining elements of oligarchy and democracy, what he called polity. It would have a large middle class, avoiding the extremes of great wealth and poverty, and would distribute political participation broadly while ensuring that qualified people held key offices. This pragmatic approach to politics, seeking what works rather than perfect ideals, typifies Aristotle's philosophical style. After Alexander ascended to power, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum. He was called a peripatetic philosopher because he liked to teach while walking around the Lyceum's covered walkway, or peripatos. At the Lyceum, Aristotle and his students conducted research into every area of knowledge: logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry, biology, physics, astronomy, psychology. Aristotle was the first great systematizer of knowledge, organizing and categorizing the results of observation and reasoning into coherent structures. Aristotle's disagreement with Plato centered on the theory of forms. Plato had placed the forms in a separate realm, transcendent and apart from the physical world. Aristotle found this unsatisfactory. How could something utterly separate from physical objects explain those objects or be known through experience? If the form of horse exists in some heavenly realm, how does that help us understand the horse standing in front of us? Aristotle proposed instead that the forms, which he called essences or species forms, existed within individual things. The essence of a horse was not something separate from horses, but was the principle that made each individual horse a horse, the pattern that shaped its matter. Matter and form, for Aristotle, were inseparable principles. Matter was the potential for being shaped. Form was the actuality that gave matter definite shape and properties. A lump of bronze had the potential to become a statue. When the sculptor imposed form upon it, the potential became actual. Every physical object was a compound of matter and form. Even the form itself could be matter for a higher form. The bronze statue's form as a statue was imposed on matter that was already bronze, which was itself a form imposed on more basic matter. To explain change, Aristotle introduced his famous theory of four causes. To truly understand why something is the way it is, you need to know four things: the material cause, what it's made of; the formal cause, what kind of thing it is, its essence; the efficient cause, what brought it into being; and the final cause, its purpose or end, its telos. Consider a marble statue of a man. The material cause is the marble. The formal cause is the shape of a man, the pattern imposed on the marble. The efficient cause is the sculptor who carved it, and the final cause is the purpose for which it was made, perhaps to honor a hero or beautify a temple. All four causes work together to explain the statue's existence. Aristotle saw the entire natural world as teleological, goal-directed. Acorns grow into oak trees because that is their telos, their natural end. Heavy objects fall downward because Earth's natural place is at the center of the universe. The cosmos itself is structured hierarchically, with each thing striving toward its natural end. Even human beings have a telos. Just as a knife's function is to cut, and it's a good knife if it cuts well, human beings have a function. to live according to reason, which is our distinctive characteristic. A good human life, the life of eudaimonia, or flourishing, is one lived in accordance with virtue, with excellence of character and intellect. This brings us to Aristotle's ethics. Unlike Plato, who sought an abstract definition of the good, Aristotle began with human life as we actually live it. What is the goal of human action? What do we all want? Happiness, he answered, but not mere pleasure or contentment. Eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or flourishing, meant living well and doing well, fulfilling one's potential as a human being. Virtue, for Aristotle, was essential to eudaimonia. But virtue was not knowledge, as Socrates had claimed. It was a disposition, a habitual way of acting and feeling, developed through practice. You become courageous by doing courageous acts, just as you become a skilled musician by practicing music. Moral virtue was a mean between extremes. Courage was the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity was the mean between stinginess and wastefulness. The virtuous person had developed the practical wisdom, which Aristotle called phronesis, to discern the mean in any given situation. This golden mean was not a mechanical average, but a flexible principle requiring judgment. What counts as generous depends on one's resources, the circumstances, the recipient. The practically wise person could navigate these complexities, acting appropriately in each situation. Virtue was not simply following rules, but developing good character, so that right action flowed naturally from one's disposition. Aristotle also valued intellectual virtues, particularly Sophia, theoretical wisdom, the contemplation of eternal truths. The highest life, he believed, was the contemplative life, spent in philosophical and scientific inquiry. Such a life came closest to the activity of God, who in Aristotle's metaphysics was pure thought thinking itself, the unmoved mover, who caused all motion and change not by pushing or pulling, but by being the ultimate object of desire, drawing all things toward perfection. Aristotle's influence on Western thought is almost impossible to overstate. His logic, systematized in works collectively known as the Organon, remained the foundation of logical theory until the 19th century. His physics and cosmology, though eventually superseded by modern science, structured scientific thought for 2,000 years. His biology was groundbreaking. He dissected animals, observed their behavior, classified them into genera and species. He was the first systematic biologist, and his careful observations were not improved upon until the Renaissance. Medieval Christian philosophers, especially Thomas Aquinas, synthesized Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology, creating a worldview that dominated European thought for centuries. Even those who rejected Aristotelian science retained its basic conceptual structure. When modern science emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries, it defined itself partly in opposition to Aristotle. But that very opposition showed his continuing power. After the deaths of the great classical philosophers, Greek thought entered what is called the Hellenistic period. Alexander the Great's conquests had spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean and into Asia, creating a cosmopolitan world of larger kingdoms and cities where the old police, the small city-state, no longer seemed the natural unit of political life. In this changed context, philosophy took on new concerns. The Hellenistic schools, Epicureanism, Stoicism, Cynicism, and Skepticism, shifted focus from metaphysics and cosmology to ethics and the question of how to live well. They were practical philosophies, offering guidance for achieving tranquility, happiness, and freedom from disturbance in a world that often seemed chaotic and beyond one's control. Epicurus founded his school in Athens around the year 300 before the Common Era. He taught in a garden, and his followers were known as the philosophers of the garden. Epicureanism is often misunderstood as advocating hedonistic pleasure-seeking, but Epicurus's understanding of pleasure was subtle and refined. Epicurus was an atomist, following Democritus in believing that reality consisted of atoms moving through void. The soul itself was made of atoms and dissolved at death. There was no afterlife, no divine judgment. The gods, if they existed, were remote and unconcerned with human affairs. This worldview was meant to be liberating, freeing people from the fear of death and divine punishment that Epicurus saw as major sources of human unhappiness. The goal of life, for Epicurus, was ataraxia, tranquility or freedom from disturbance. Pleasure was good, pain was bad, but the highest pleasure was not wild excitement or sensory indulgence. It was the pleasure of serenity, of being free from physical pain and mental anguish. The wise person sought modest, sustainable pleasures: friendship, philosophical conversation, simple food. Excessive desires led to dependency and disappointment. By limiting one's desires to what was natural and necessary, one could achieve lasting contentment. Epicurus and his followers lived simply in the garden, sharing meals and conversation. They formed a community bound by friendship, which Epicurus considered one of life's greatest goods. Though later centuries would use Epicurean to mean indulgent and luxury-loving, the original Epicureans practiced moderation and valued peace of mind above all. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium around the same time, took a different approach to achieving tranquility. The Stoics taught in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch in Athens, from which they took their name. They developed a complete philosophical system encompassing logic, physics, and ethics, but it was their ethics that had the greatest impact. The Stoics believed in a rational, divine logos that ordered the cosmos. Everything that happened was part of a providential plan, determined by fate. Human beings, as rational creatures, could align themselves with this cosmic rationality. The key was to distinguish between what was in one's control and what was not. External events, other people's actions, even one's own body and health were not fully in one's control. But one's own judgments, values, and choices were. The Stoic wise person accepted whatever happened with equanimity, recognizing it as part of the rational order of the universe. Loss, pain, even death were neither good nor bad in themselves. Only virtue was genuinely good, and vice genuinely bad. External circumstances were indifferent, though some were preferred to others. This radical reevaluation freed the Stoic from the emotional turbulence that afflicted most people. By not valuing external things too highly, by accepting fate with grace, one achieved apatheia. Not apathy in the modern sense, but freedom from destructive passions. Stoicism had a strong ethical dimension. Because all human beings shared in the divine logos, all were brothers and sisters, part of a universal human community. The Stoic should fulfill social duties, act justly, show kindness, and live in accordance with nature, which meant living according to reason. Stoic philosophy attracted many followers, including some of Rome's greatest figures. The slave Epictetus, who taught that freedom lay in accepting one's fate, and the emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wrote his meditations as personal philosophical exercises in Stoic virtue. The Cynics took a more radical approach to philosophy as a way of life. Antisthenes, a follower of Socrates, is sometimes credited as the founder, but the most famous Cynic was Diogenes of Sinope. The Cynics believed that conventional society was corrupt and that virtue consisted in living according to nature, which meant rejecting social norms, possessions, and pretensions. Diogenes lived with extreme simplicity, reportedly dwelling in a large ceramic jar in Athens. He owned almost nothing, begged for food, and flouted every social convention. When Alexander the Great visited him and asked if there was anything he could do for him, Diogenes replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." The Cynics believed that by stripping away all the artificial layers of culture, by living like dogs, the word cynic comes from the Greek kynikos, meaning dog-like, one could achieve true freedom and self-sufficiency. Though their lifestyle seemed harsh, the Cynics were practicing a kind of spiritual discipline. By demonstrating that one needed almost nothing to live, they challenged the materialism and status-seeking of their contemporaries. They were social critics, using shocking behavior to make philosophical points. Their influence can be seen in ascetic traditions throughout history, in those who renounce worldly goods to pursue spiritual or philosophical goals. Finally, the skeptics questioned whether knowledge was possible at all. Pyrrha of Elis, who traveled with Alexander the Great and encountered Indian philosophers, founded the skeptical tradition. The skeptics argued that for every argument supporting a claim, an equally strong argument could support the opposite. Since reason couldn't decide between opposing views, the wise course was to suspend judgment, to avoid committing to any belief. This might seem like a recipe for paralysis, but the skeptics claimed it led to ataraxia, the same tranquility sought by Epicureans and Stoics. By giving up the quest for certainty, by accepting that they couldn't know the truth about ultimate matters, the skeptics freed themselves from the anxiety of dogmatism. They lived according to appearances, following customs and common sense without making metaphysical commitments. These Hellenistic schools show philosophy turning inward, becoming more personal and practical. In an age when individuals had less control over political life, when the old certainties were dissolving, philosophy offered tools for achieving inner peace and living well despite external circumstances. As we bring this journey through ancient Greek philosophy to a gentle close, we can see the extraordinary achievement of these thinkers. In the space of a few centuries, in a small corner of the Mediterranean world, human beings invented critical thinking, systematic logic, scientific inquiry, ethical reasoning, political philosophy, and so much more. They asked fundamental questions that we still grapple with today. What is real? How can we know what is good? How should we live? The Pre-Socratics began by seeking natural explanations for natural phenomena, replacing myth with reason. They proposed theories about the fundamental nature of reality, initiating traditions of scientific and philosophical inquiry that continue to this day. Socrates turned philosophy toward ethics and self-knowledge, insisting that the unexamined life was not worth living. Plato constructed a comprehensive metaphysics centered on eternal forms and explored the nature of justice, love, knowledge, and the soul. Aristotle systematized human knowledge, developing logic, investigating nature, and articulating theories of ethics and politics that shaped Western thought for 2 millennia. The Hellenistic philosophers offered practical wisdom for living well, developing techniques for achieving tranquility and virtue that people still find valuable. And through all of this there ran a common thread, the conviction that human reason could illuminate reality, that careful thinking and open dialogue could lead to truth. That philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a way of life. The ancient Greeks did not answer all the questions they raised. In many cases, they discovered that questions they thought simple were bewilderingly complex. But they established the questions, the methods, the standards of argument that philosophy would use ever after. They showed that ideas had consequences, that how we think shapes how we live. They demonstrated the power of wonder, the importance of doubt, the value of seeking truth, even when truth proves elusive. Every time we question an assumption, demand evidence for a claim, seek a rational explanation, or engage in dialogue to understand another's view, we are heirs to the ancient Greek philosophers. Every time we pause to examine our lives, to ask whether we are living well and truly, we walk in Socrates' footsteps. Every time we pursue knowledge for its own sake, we join Aristotle in his Lyceum. The questions they asked remain our questions. The wonder they felt remains our wonder. As this journey comes to rest, allow yourself to feel gratitude for those ancient voices, those men who walked dusty roads and gathered in shaded porticos, who questioned and argued and wrote, who dared to think the universe was knowable and that human beings could know it. Let their curiosity inspire your own. Let their commitment to truth and virtue resonate in your own life. If you found peace in this exploration of ancient wisdom, I invite you to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your support helps others find their way to these quiet reflections, one seeker at a time. Together, we keep alive the great conversation begun so long ago. For now, let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of your body sinking into rest. Let the marble columns and olive groves fade softly from your mind's eye. The ancient philosophers have shared their wisdom across the centuries, and now you carry a piece of it forward. Rest well, knowing that wonder and wisdom are always there, waiting in the stillness, ready to be rediscovered. Good night.